The diary that changed everything. A psychologist, his wife, and the final session. Grayson Harper sat in his spacious office, lost in thought. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting shadows on the wooden desk where a cup of cold espresso rested. The morning seemed ordinary, even mundane, until his eyes fell on an unfamiliar item in the corner of the room. On the small table near the patient's couch lay a battered leather-bound diary. Grayson didn't recall seeing it there before. He set aside the notebook he had been holding and approached the diary. It looked unusual, too old to belong to any of his patients. He picked it up, feeling the rough texture of the leather cover beneath his fingers. A red fabric bookmark stuck out from between the pages, as if beckoning him to open it. Questions raced through his mind. Who could have left this here? And, more importantly, why? Hesitantly, Grayson opened the page marked by the ribbon. Inked letters, slightly blurred by time, formed words he first skimmed but then focused on. I can't keep hiding this secret. It's eating me alive. He trusts me, but I betray him every day, every hour. She says it's ours, that he'll never find out. But how long can we keep playing this game? He read aloud, and the words hung in the air like an unsettling whisper. Grayson froze for a moment. There was something intensely personal, almost painful, about the text. He flipped back a few pages, trying to understand the context. The entries spoke of encounters filled with passion and fear of being discovered. The woman mentioned remained anonymous, but the author, a man, wrote with such raw honesty that it felt like a confession. A sudden thought struck him. Could it be one of his patients? But which one of them could have written something like this? He knew each of them, or so he thought. A soft knock came at the door. Grayson quickly shut the diary and placed it on his desk. His assistant, Julia, peeked into the office. Dr. Harper, you have a session with Mr. Collins in 5 minutes. Are you ready? She asked, careful not to disturb his concentration. Yes, Julia, thank you. Please send him in, Grayson replied, trying to maintain his composure. As the door closed, he glanced back at the diary. Most of his patients carried complex stories, but this was something entirely different. He felt an almost magnetic pull toward the pages. What are you hiding? He whispered, the words sounding like a challenge. The session with Andrew Collins followed its usual pattern. The young man, struggling with trust and relationship issues, spoke about his childhood and feelings of loneliness. But today, something was different. Andrew seemed more tense than usual. His hands gripped the armrests of the chair involuntarily, and he avoided direct eye contact. Andrew, you seem particularly troubled today. Would you like to share what's on your mind? Grayson asked, watching his reaction carefully. Andrew hesitated, then cautiously responded. There's something I've been keeping inside for a long time. It concerns someone I deeply respect, but at the same time, I feel guilty. Have you ever wanted to tell the truth, but feared it would destroy everything? Andrew's words made Grayson tense. They sounded eerily similar to the entries in the diary. He gently guided the conversation further. Sometimes, confessing can be difficult, but it's also a way to free yourself from the burden. You can trust me, Grayson said. Andrew looked at him, as if weighing whether to reveal more. I feel like I'm living a double life. There's someone who trusts me, but I deceive them. I want to stop, but I don't know how, Andrew admitted, his voice trembling slightly. Grayson tilted his head, pondering Andrew's words. He noticed the faint quiver in his voice and decided not to push him too hard. It's natural to feel fear before revealing the truth, Andrew. But remember, every truth eventually finds its way to the surface, he said. Andrew nodded, but looked uncertain. The session ended, but Grayson's thoughts lingered. Could Andrew be the diary's author? Or was this just a coincidence? Everything was becoming more complicated than he had anticipated. Returning to his desk after the session, Grayson picked up the diary again. This time, he decided to examine the earlier entries more closely. The first pages contained only dates and brief notes, but further in, something deeper began to unfold. The author described feelings of guilt, fear, and at the same time, an unquenchable passion for a woman shrouded in secrets. He trusts me, but if he knew, Grayson read. Suddenly, he realized this entry might have a personal connection. Who was this he? And why was the author so terrified of being discovered? This was no ordinary find. The diary seemed to speak to him, stirring unease and a drive to uncover the truth. Grayson knew this story. This was just the beginning. Grayson Harper found himself back in his office after a restless night. The diary he had discovered the day before wouldn't leave his thoughts. At night, he kept recalling the lines written in it, trying to unravel who might have left this artifact in his office and why. But now, his thoughts took a different turn. In the morning, he opened the diary again. This time, he decided to delve deeper and read more. The author of the text, enigmatic and immersed in guilt, continued to describe meetings with a woman who was both the object of his passion and the source of his fear. Grayson noticed the handwriting became uneven whenever the author described his feelings, hinting at deep emotional turmoil. I told her we couldn't keep going like this, but she just smiled and said he wouldn't suspect a thing. Her confidence drives me insane. How much longer can I bear this double burden? Grayson froze. All these entries felt uncannily similar to what he had encountered in his professional practice. Paranoid fears intertwined with forbidden emotions. But the main question haunted him. Who was this woman? And, more importantly, who was he? His gaze lingered on the names that occasionally appeared in the text. Snippets, hints, but nothing concrete. Yet, one particular phrase caught Grayson's attention. He's not as perfect as she thinks. She deserves better. These words led him to wonder. Could this be about someone he knew? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Eliza, his wife. She stopped by the office to bring him lunch and, as always, greeted him with a warm smile. But today, there was something peculiar in her expression. Something hidden. "How are you, darling?" she asked, placing the bag on his desk. "Fine, just a bit tired," Grayson replied, trying to appear natural. Her gaze briefly flicked to the desk, and Grayson noticed her eyes linger on the diary for a moment. But she said nothing, quickly looking away. "Will you be home late tonight?" he asked, making it seem like casual conversation. "I have a meeting with friends." "Don't wait up for me," she replied hastily, as if eager to end the topic. Grayson nodded, but his suspicions deepened. She had indeed been away in the evenings more frequently, and these meetings with friends were starting to seem less convincing. When she left, he returned to the diary. Flipping through the pages, he suddenly stopped at an entry he hadn't noticed before. It mentioned small details: the woman's favorite perfume, her habit of twisting a ring on her finger when nervous. All of it felt oddly familiar. This is impossible, he thought, trying to shake off the idea. But the more he analyzed it, the more it reminded him of Eliza. The next session of the day was with a new patient, a young man named Jonathan. He had a weary look, as if carrying a heavy burden. During their conversation, he mentioned several times the challenges of a relationship with a woman who never told him everything. Grayson steered the conversation toward neutral ground, but a suspicion took root within him that every new detail about the diary only deepened his personal crisis. The diary seemed to mirror his own life, and it was beginning to frighten him. After the session, he reread the entries. One of them mentioned an upcoming event, something that could change everything. This mysterious date made him wonder. Could the diary be more connected to his life than it seemed at first glance? Grayson opened his office computer and started searching for any clues. His persistence and professional instincts led him to one conclusion. He needed to find more links between the text and reality. But now, he was certain. The diary was the key to a truth that could either destroy his life or open the door to something new. That session and his subsequent reflections left him with a choice: to leave everything as it was and risk living a lie, or to dive into a dangerous game that could change everything. Grayson returned home later than he had planned. The day had been taxing, and thoughts of the diary wouldn't leave him. He felt as though this enigmatic object was pulling him in, feeding the doubts that grew with every page. Eliza was already asleep, but her belongings, a handbag carelessly left on the kitchen table and a coat draped over the back of a chair, indicated she had returned not long ago. Grayson stood at the bedroom door, looking at her peaceful face. He caught himself thinking he now saw her differently. His perspective had shifted. Something in her behavior, in her looks, and her manner of speaking now seemed mysterious, as though she were hiding a part of herself. But he couldn't decide if this was just his imagination or if something truly had changed. The morning began like any other. Eliza prepared breakfast, humming a tune to herself as she always did. But now, Grayson listened to her voice, trying to detect any hidden notes. "You look tired, darling," she said, glancing at him as he walked into the kitchen. "Just a lot of work." He waved it off, sitting down at the table. She placed a cup of coffee in front of him and smiled. It was a familiar scene, but this time, the simplicity of it felt like a suspicious question. Was everything truly as it seemed? "Are you working late again today?" Eliza asked, as if casually. "Yes, a few important sessions," he replied. She nodded and averted her gaze, as if she'd lost interest in the conversation. That moment made Grayson pause. Something had changed in their communication. His attention to detail was sharper now than ever before. When he arrived at the office, Julia was already waiting for him by his door. "Dr. Harper, you have an unusual schedule today. Mrs. Montgomery requested an extra session, so I've added her to your calendar," she said. Grayson nodded, reviewing the list. Mrs. Montgomery, a senior woman who always spoke in riddles, leaving him perplexed after every session. Her sudden request for a meeting seemed odd, but he agreed. The session with her was as intense as ever. But this time, her words carried an unexpected undertone. She talked about trust, about how hard it was to keep secrets when they grew too heavy. "Have you ever felt like you hold a key but don't know what it opens?" she asked at the end of the session, her eyes glimmering as though she knew something important. Grayson couldn't answer. Her words felt as though they were directed at him personally. Back in his office, he opened the diary again. This time, he was determined to find something specific, something that could identify the author. And then he saw it. One of the pages mentioned a meeting at a cafe, describing details of the interior that he recognized. It was a place where he often had lunch with Eliza. Coincidence or a clue? The more he read, the more convinced he became that this diary was connected to him and to Eliza. That evening, he decided to test her. Over dinner, he began a conversation about secrets, describing a situation similar to the one in the diary but with fabricated details. Eliza listened, but her reaction was unusual. She nervously twisted the ring on her finger, the very habit mentioned in the text. "What do you think about it?" Grayson asked, watching her carefully. She paused for a moment, her gaze distant, but then she smiled. "It's an interesting story, but it's probably just fiction." His heart raced. Her response was unexpected, but the tone in which she said it made him think even more. Grayson could no longer ignore the obvious. He knew he had to continue seeking the truth, even if it seemed too dangerous. The next day, he returned to the diary with a new purpose. Now, he wasn't just looking for clues, but for something that could confirm or deny his suspicions. And then it happened. One of the entries mentioned an event he remembered. A party at a friend's house where Eliza seemed particularly distant. The text described a conversation between the author and the woman he admired with such passion that there was no doubt about their connection. This entry was the final straw. Grayson knew he couldn't stop now. The diary had led him to the edge, beyond which lay a truth that could change everything. Grayson stayed alone in his office, trying to recall everything Andrew had said during their session. The patient's words seemed both too vague and too alarming. Why were his hands trembling? Why did he avoid direct eye contact? But most importantly, could it all be related to the diary? Grayson approached the desk where the mysterious notebook lay. He carefully examined the cover, looking for any clues. After a pause, he opened the diary again, this time to the first page, where he noticed small markings, barely visible initials, EK. "EK," he whispered, running his fingers over the page. The letters immediately reminded him of Andrew Collins. But how was this possible? Grayson would never have guessed that his patient might have left something like this in his office. To be sure, he revisited the sections mentioning she and he and reread the passages, trying to find anything else that could confirm his suspicion. The more Grayson read, the more coincidences he found. The author of the entries described himself as someone seeking understanding and solace. His feelings for her seemed so intense that they defied any moral norms. And although mentions of her husband were minimal, the author clearly feared his wrath. Grayson paused and pondered. He recalled how Andrew had spoken during past sessions about a woman who had changed his life but had always avoided details. This could be a coincidence. But how else could he explain the initials? To relieve the tension, Grayson walked over to the window and took a deep breath of fresh air. On the horizon, clouds loomed, as if signaling an impending storm. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Julia, his assistant, peeked in. "Dr. Harper, will you be staying late? I can leave if you need some peace." "No, it's fine, Julia. Just a lot on my mind. Thank you for checking in. I'll call you if I need anything." When she left, Grayson returned to the notebook. The more he thought about Andrew, the more he remembered details that had seemed insignificant before. For instance, how Andrew would sometimes pause, choosing his words carefully before answering questions, or how his voice changed when he spoke about her. In the end, Grayson decided not to rush to conclusions. He knew the best way to uncover the truth was through observation and gradual trust building. The next session with Andrew would be pivotal. To prepare, he carefully noted down key moments from the diary. He didn't plan to confront Andrew directly, but he needed the right words to prompt the patient to open up. Sitting at his desk, Grayson felt mixed emotions. On the one hand, he was filled with curiosity. On the other, anxiety grew. What if it were true? What if Andrew was indeed connected to his wife? And what would he do if his suspicions were confirmed? It was one of those questions even an experienced psychologist couldn't answer. The next day started routinely. Sunlight flooded the office, but the sense of calm it usually brought was overshadowed. Grayson couldn't get the diary out of his head. The initials, the words that felt both intimate and piercing, like a blade brushing against skin but not yet cutting. He knew the answers were close, but he feared what he might find. The first session of the morning was routine. The client spoke about relationship problems, and Grayson listened, nodding automatically and offering words of support, though his mind was elsewhere. When she left, he sank into his chair and pulled the diary from the drawer. Once more, he flipped through the pages, searching for the details he might have missed. The entries were the same. Confessions of feelings, fear of being exposed, and something more. A hint of a deep internal struggle. But this time, another fragment caught his attention, one he hadn't lingered on before. The date was 2 months ago, the same week Grayson and his wife, Eliza, celebrated their wedding anniversary. The entry described an evening when "we were in the same room, and I thought I'd be recognized." Grayson closed his eyes, trying to remember that day. Eliza had invited a few friends and colleagues for dinner. He remembered that Andrew had been among the guests. The young man had been rather reserved, but Grayson assumed it was just his usual demeanor. And now, everything seemed different. To maintain focus, he jotted down a few notes in his notebook. 2 months ago, dinner party, Andrew's behavior, odd glance at Eliza, verify. When the time for Andrew's session arrived, Grayson was tense but prepared. He took his seat across from the patient and began the conversation as he always did. "How was your week, Andrew?" The man seemed calm, but Grayson noticed a slight change. His eyes avoided direct contact, and his fingers nervously fidgeted with the hem of his jacket. "Fine, Dr. Harper. I've been thinking about what you said last time, about the truth and how it can change lives." "And what have you decided?" Grayson asked gently. Andrew paused, staring at the floor. "I've decided I'm not ready yet, that it could hurt too many people." Grayson nodded, his heart tightening, though he maintained an outward calm. "That's okay. Everyone needs their own time to reach an important decision. But remember, it's always easier to tell the truth to someone willing to listen." Andrew nodded, but said nothing more. For the rest of the session, they spoke about general topics, but by the end, Grayson felt they were on the brink of a breakthrough. As the session concluded, Grayson sat at his desk, going over everything Andrew had said. His patient's words seemed vague yet unsettling. Why had his hands trembled? Why did he avoid eye contact? Most importantly, could this all be connected to the diary? Grayson returned his gaze to the mysterious notebook on his desk. He carefully examined the cover, looking for any clues. After a moment's hesitation, he opened it again, this time to the first page. where he noticed faint markings, barely visible initials, EK. EK, he whispered, running his fingers over the page. The letters immediately brought to mind Andrew Collins. But how could this be? Grayson had never imagined that his patient might leave something like this in his office. To be sure, he revisited the sections mentioning she and he and reread the passages, trying to uncover anything else that could confirm his suspicions. Andrew, is there a place where you feel safe? A place where you can truly be yourself? Grayson asked unexpectedly. Andrew hesitated. There is one place. A cafe I go to. I like it because it's always quiet. Grayson nodded, as if it was of no special importance, though inside, his pulse quickened. Sometimes such places become our sanctuaries, he said. Do you go there often? A few times a week, Andrew replied briefly, avoiding details. Grayson didn't press further. He knew solving this puzzle required patience. After the session, he picked up the diary again, focusing on a signature at the end of one of the entries. There were only initials, but now he was certain. EK stood for Andrew Collins. His suspicions turned into certainty, but now a new question loomed. Who was the woman Andrew was meeting? And how was this all connected to him? Over the next few days, Grayson couldn't find peace. He decided to return to the cafe at the same time Andrew was said to visit. He chose a table nearby and ordered coffee. 15 minutes later, Andrew entered the cafe. He looked focused and slightly tense. In his hands, he carried a notebook, which confirmed Grayson's suspicions. A few minutes later, a woman approached Andrew. Tall, with dark hair, graceful movements, and a mysterious smile. Grayson froze. He recognized her. It was Eliza. Grayson sat still, as if the world had stopped along with his breathing. He watched as Eliza sat across from Andrew, as though this was a routine for them. Her movements were smooth, her face calm, though her eyes carried a hint of tension. Andrew looked up, and a barely noticeable expression of relief crossed his face, as if this meeting was the only place he could breathe freely. Grayson didn't look away, though it felt like his heart would burst from his chest. He couldn't hear their conversation, but every gesture, every tilt of their heads was loud enough to fill the silence in his mind. Eliza smiled and touched Andrew's wrist. He returned her smile, and something unspoken passed between them, something that needed no words. Grayson felt a wave of anger, pain, and disappointment rising within him. But he held himself back. There was something more in this moment than just betrayal. It was something he needed to understand before he acted. When the meeting ended, Eliza and Andrew stood and headed for the exit. Grayson remained seated at his table, unwilling to draw attention to himself. His hands gripped his cup so tightly he feared it might break. He felt like a spectator in the theater of his own life, but he despised the plot. Back home, he tried to act natural, though it was almost impossible. Eliza, as always, greeted him with a light smile and asked about his day. Her voice sounded as though nothing unusual had happened. Grayson smiled in return, but inside, a storm raged. Later that evening, after Eliza went to bed, Grayson stayed in his study. The diary lay before him, as if challenging him to read it again. He opened it to the latest entries written in EK's hand. There was a mention of an upcoming meeting, planned to take place where it all began. Grayson closed his eyes, trying to recall what that place could be. The entries were vague, but one detail came to mind. An old park by the lake that he and Eliza often visited at the beginning of their relationship. That place had always been special to them. Could Eliza have taken someone else there? The next day, he decided to test his theory. After his next session, he went to the park. The winter air was cold, but it didn't deter him. Grayson walked the paths, searching for something to confirm his suspicions. Then he saw them. Eliza and Andrew stood by the lake, deep in conversation. They didn't notice him. Grayson stayed at a distance, hiding behind the trees. He watched as Eliza placed her hand on Andrew's shoulder, and Andrew leaned in, as if whispering something to her. Their movements were too intimate to leave room for doubt. Grayson felt his anger building, but he restrained himself. Acting on emotion now wouldn't help. He decided to wait until they left and check if there was anything that could give him more information. When Eliza and Andrew left the park, Grayson approached the spot where they had been standing. On the ground, partially hidden under fallen leaves, lay a small note. He picked it up and saw a short message written in a familiar handwriting. "This must stay between us. We can't take any risks." Grayson pressed the note to his chest. It was the proof he'd been missing. But what exactly were they hiding? When he returned home, Grayson decided to take a different approach. He knew that directly accusing Eliza would be unwise. Instead, he began analyzing every detail of their life together, searching for gaps that could provide answers. He also planned to speak with Andrew during their next session, but this time, not as a therapist but as a man seeking the truth. He was forming a plan in his mind, knowing that this conversation would be decisive. The next morning, Eliza acted as if nothing had happened. She prepared breakfast and talked about her plans for the day. Grayson listened, nodding, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He needed to find a way to draw her into an honest conversation, but the perfect moment had yet to arise. After Eliza left, Grayson returned to the diary. On its final pages were entries hinting at the author's fear of exposure. This led Grayson to suspect that there was another layer to the story that he had yet to uncover. He put the diary aside and picked up the note he'd found in the park. The handwriting felt familiar, but he couldn't determine whether it belonged to Andrew or Eliza. This puzzle remained unsolved, but Grayson was determined to find the answers. His life had changed dramatically in just a few days, but he knew this was only the beginning. What he had discovered so far only fueled his curiosity and drove him to seek the truth, no matter how bitter it might be. Grayson knew time was working against him. After finding the note in the park, his suspicions had grown into an insatiable desire to understand the whole picture. He began to feel as though he was on the brink of uncovering something much larger than simple betrayal. But what exactly Eliza and Andrew were hiding remained a mystery. This time, Grayson decided to take a risk. He took a day off, telling his patients he had personal matters to attend to, and went to Andrew's office. It was a sleek, modern space in the city center, perfectly reflecting Andrew's polished image. In the lobby, he was greeted by a secretary who looked at him with mild curiosity. "Dr. Harper, how can I help you?" she asked with a professional smile. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Cole," he replied, trying to keep his emotions in check. The secretary nodded, but her expression turned more concerned. "Unfortunately, Mr. Cole isn't in the office right now. He's taken a few days off. If you'd like, I can leave him a message." Days off. Those two words put Grayson on edge. Why had Andrew decided to disappear now? He thanked the secretary and left the office, feeling the tension in his chest grow. On his way home, Grayson stopped for coffee. His thoughts were scattered, but two figures stood out clearly in his mind, Eliza and Andrew. He opened the diary he now carried with him and reread the entry about risk and the necessity of silence. These words took on new meaning. Grayson felt that the key to the mystery was hidden in these lines, though he couldn't yet decipher it. When he returned home, he noticed something different in Eliza's room. Her desk looked too tidy, as if she'd been trying to hide something. Grayson decided to check the drawers. In the third one, he found a small box wrapped in paper. Inside was a pair of gold cufflinks engraved with the initials EK. This discovery shocked him, but it also confirmed his suspicions. That night, Grayson couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, contemplating how to confront Eliza about everything. But the more he thought, the more he realized that a direct confrontation wouldn't solve anything. He needed more evidence, more facts, to understand why all of this had happened. The next morning, Eliza behaved as usual. She prepared breakfast, talked about her plans, and joked, as if everything between them was fine. But now, Grayson looked at her differently. He saw the anxiety behind her smile, a tension she was skillfully concealing. "What do you think about spending the weekend at the lake house?" Eliza suddenly suggested, setting her coffee cup aside. The suggestion caught Grayson off guard. The lake had always been their special place. His heart clenched, but he kept his composure. "Great idea," he said. "We've needed a getaway for a while now." Eliza smiled, and he noticed a hint of relief in her eyes. Perhaps she was trying to restore the trust she subconsciously felt she'd lost. But Grayson knew this trip would be his chance to get answers. The road to the lake was quiet. Eliza talked about work, future plans, and even reminisced about how they used to spend time here. Grayson listened, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He decided that this time he would pay attention to every detail. When they arrived at the cabin, everything looked almost perfect. The winter landscape added a sense of tranquility, but for Grayson, it was just a facade. He watched Eliza as she unpacked, seemingly trying to create an illusion of normalcy. But his attention was drawn to her bag. It was always neatly organized. But this time something was different. Several papers were sticking out of a side pocket. When Eliza went out for a walk, Grayson decided to check the bag. Inside, he found letters addressed to Andrew. They were filled with hints, but one line made his heart stop. "We must see this through. He mustn't find out." Grayson felt his hands tremble. These words were definitive proof that something was going on between Eliza and Andrew. But what exactly? He was piecing together a puzzle, but the full picture was still unclear. When Eliza returned, he hid the letters and tried to act normal. She didn't suspect a thing. That night was the hardest for Grayson. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what to do next. He knew he needed to uncover the truth immediately, but the fear of losing Eliza held him back. The next day, they went for a walk. Eliza seemed more relaxed, her laughter sounding so genuine that Grayson almost believed everything would be okay. But then she said something that reignited his suspicions. "I've always known you were stronger than you seem," she said, looking at him. "You don't give up, even when everything is against you." The words were cryptic. Grayson felt his doubts resurface. He knew this time he would have to risk everything to find the answers. Grayson sat in the cabin by the fireplace, watching the flames dance before him. His thoughts were chaotic, but with each passing moment, he felt the pieces of the puzzle starting to come together. The letters he'd found, the diary, the initials, even Eliza's words from the day before. They all seemed to form part of a larger mystery slipping just out of his grasp. Eliza, meanwhile, was sorting through things in another room. Her behavior was calm, almost carefree, but Grayson knew her too well to trust this facade. He decided it was time to take another step. Perhaps this time, he could gather more information. "Want to go for a walk?" she asked, poking her head into the living room. It started snowing outside. "It's beautiful." Grayson smiled and nodded. They stepped outside, and the cold winter wind immediately brushed against their faces. The snow did make the landscape magical, but Grayson felt anything but enchanted. They walked along the frozen lake, and he finally gathered the courage to ask a question. "Eliza," he began, trying to keep his tone steady, "you've seemed different lately. Maybe it's just my impression, but it feels like you're hiding something. Does it have to do with us?" Eliza stopped and looked at him. Something flashed in her eyes that Grayson couldn't immediately interpret. It was a mix of fear and determination. "Why would you think that?" she asked. Her voice was soft, but there was an edge to it that made him wary. "I don't know," he replied. "It's just a feeling. If there's something you want to tell me, now would be the best time." Eliza seemed to consider his words, and for a moment, Grayson thought she was about to tell him the truth. But instead, she simply smiled faintly. "You always analyze everything," she said. "It's in your nature. But sometimes, things aren't as complicated as they seem." This answer didn't satisfy Grayson, but he decided not to press her for now. They returned to the cabin, and Eliza went to take a shower. This gave him another opportunity to search her belongings. He felt awful, as though he was betraying her trust, but his need for the truth was stronger. This time, he found a notebook filled with notes. The pages were filled with plans, lists, and even sketches, but among them were several entries that caught his attention. One read, "House, Week 3, discuss with Andrew." Another, "Baby, how to explain everything." Grayson felt his heart stop. Baby. The word echoed in his mind like a ringing bell. Eliza returned to the room, and he barely had time to put the notebook back in its place. She looked refreshed and relaxed, as though nothing had happened. But now Grayson looked at her with a new understanding. She was pregnant, and everything pointed to Andrew being involved. Grayson sat in silence, his hands resting on the table, tapping nervously as his inner turmoil played out. He watched Eliza flip through the pages of a book, as if nothing had happened. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a soft glow over their surroundings. Grayson felt the words he'd just read in the notebook echo in his mind. Baby. Andrew. House. The words seemed louder than the crackling logs. But he decided to change his approach. He didn't want to play the detective or let their relationship devolve into a battle of guesses and investigations. After all, Eliza was the woman he loved. Grayson took a deep breath and sipped his tea, now long cold. Eliza, he finally said, can I ask you something without you feeling pressured? Eliza looked up, her face expressing nothing but genuine curiosity. Of course, she said, setting her book aside. What is it? He felt the heavy words stuck in his throat, but decided to speak his feelings openly, without hints. Lately, I've felt like there's some invisible wall between us. Something you can't or won't tell me. And it's not just about the two of us. I feel like there's someone else in your life. Maybe I'm misinterpreting it, but I want you to know. I'm ready to listen. I'm ready to understand. Eliza lowered her gaze. Her hands gripped the edge of the chair, and her eyes seemed to search for salvation in the cracks of the wooden floor. She remained silent, but her silence was louder than any words. Grayson, she began softly, I don't know how to tell you this. It's not that simple. He leaned forward, trying to catch her gaze. Start with the simplest thing. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Eliza took a slow breath and looked at him. Her eyes held a deep mix of guilt and anxiety. I'm pregnant, she said, lifting her eyes to meet his. Her voice trembled, but it seemed as though saying it brought her a small sense of relief. Grayson froze. The words hit like a blow, but at the same time, they brought a strange warmth. He had always dreamed of having a family, of children, but now, it all felt surreal. That's wonderful, he finally said, though his voice carried more questions than joy. Why didn't you tell me earlier? Eliza looked away again. Her silence said more than any words could. Grayson realized there was something else she wasn't saying, and though anxiety began to rise within him, he decided not to push. Grayson, I was afraid, she started, as if gathering her strength. Afraid of how you would take it. Afraid of your reaction. Why should you be afraid? He asked, surprised. We've always been a team. We've gotten through everything together. Eliza looked at him. A battle was evident in her eyes. Because I didn't know how you'd react to the fact that I'm planning a life that might be a little different from what we imagined. Different? Grayson felt a heavy weight tighten around his chest. Yes, she said, her voice trembling. But that doesn't mean I don't love you. It just means I want to make sure everything is right. For the baby. For us. Grayson fell silent again. His thoughts were a tangled web. She was hiding something, but at the same time, she was being honest about other things. He could see how hard it was for her to find the right words. And while his unease grew, he understood that the most important thing right now was to give her time. I want you to know one thing, he said, gripping her hand. I'm here, and I'm ready to support you, no matter what this is. Eliza squeezed his hand in response, but there was still a haze in her eyes that he couldn't decipher. Grayson woke early the next morning as the sky began to lighten. The first rays of sunlight peeked through the thin curtains, and the house was wrapped in deep silence. Lying in bed, he reflected on how things had gotten to this point. His role as a therapist had taught him to find connections, even the smallest ones, between actions and motives. But this time, the problem hit much closer to home than he was used to. Eliza lay beside him, her face serene, but he knew it was just a facade. She, too, was aware that too much had gone unsaid between them. Rising quietly, Grayson left the room, letting her sleep. He dialed Andrew's number. The decision to talk to him was risky but necessary. The line rang several times before Andrew's voice came through. Hello? The voice was familiar and calm, but Grayson sensed an underlying unease. It's Grayson, he said. We need to meet. Dr. Harper, is this urgent? Andrew asked, trying to keep his tone steady. Yes, it's important. Let's meet in an hour at the cafe by the park. Andrew paused briefly before agreeing. Grayson headed to the designated spot, trying to manage his emotions. Professional ethics had taught him restraint, but this situation went beyond standard boundaries. Andrew arrived on time, as always. He looked a little tense, but tried to mask it. Grayson gestured for him to sit. "I'm listening, doctor," Andrew said, attempting to maintain his composure. Grayson decided to get straight to the point. "Andrew, Eliza is pregnant." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Andrew didn't respond immediately. He tried to look away, but it only confirmed Grayson's suspicions. "And I know it involves you," Grayson added. Andrew inhaled deeply, trying to steady himself. "I never wanted it to happen this way." "But it did," Grayson replied sharply. "And now you need to explain why." Andrew fell silent, as if his answer required an internal struggle. "I was weak," he finally said. "She was there for me when I was at my lowest. It's not an excuse, but it's the truth." Grayson felt anger rising inside him. "You were my patient," he said. "How could you let this happen?" "I know what I did was wrong," Andrew admitted. "But it was more than just a mistake. It was an emotional escape we both needed." "And now?" Grayson asked coldly. "What do you plan to do?" Andrew looked up, his face exhausted. "I want this child to have a normal life, and I'll do whatever it takes to make that possible." Grayson stood up, his hands trembling. "And did you think about my life? About how this would affect me?" Andrew remained silent. "I'll figure it out myself," Grayson said, leaving him at the table. When Grayson returned home, he saw Eliza sitting by the window, waiting for him. Her face was full of anxiety. "Did you talk to him?" she asked without looking up. "Yes," he replied. "And now I know everything." Eliza didn't deny anything. Her silence spoke volumes. "Why didn't you just tell me?" Grayson asked. "Because I was afraid of losing you," she answered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I made a mistake, Grayson. I want to fix it." Grayson stared at her for a long time before finally speaking. "We'll figure it out together. But I don't know how yet." It wasn't a promise, but it was something. Something they could try to rebuild on. Eliza sat in the kitchen, turning a cup of tea in her hands. Her eyes were fixed on the steam rising from the cup as if searching for answers in it. Grayson silently watched her from across the room. His thoughts were chaotic, but he tried to maintain outward composure. This situation demanded more than emotional reactions. It required a plan. "We can't go on like this," he finally said, breaking the tense silence. It's tearing us apart." Eliza looked up, the exhaustion evident in her gaze. "What do you want me to say?" she asked. "That I ruined our lives? That I made the worst mistake of my life?" "I'm not looking for confessions," Grayson replied. "I'm looking for a way forward." Eliza set the cup down and rested her hands on the table. Her shoulders trembled slightly. "Do you think I don't want that too?" she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "But what can I do?" Grayson sat beside her, trying to focus on the core of the conversation. He knew now wasn't the time for accusations or emotions. "We have options," he said, "but we need to honestly figure out what we want and what we can do." Eliza looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. "You're talking about us, but I can see you pulling away. You can't forgive me, can you?" Grayson fell silent. His silence was the answer she had been afraid to hear. "It's not about forgiveness," he finally said. "It's about how to move forward." He stood and began pacing the room, thinking over his words. "We can keep pretending everything is fine," he said. "But that's not true. We can separate and start new lives apart. Or we can try to find a way to stay together, despite everything." Eliza wiped her tears and looked at him. "And what do you want?" she asked. Grayson paused before answering. "I want the truth. And I want to know that you're willing to fight for us, too." Eliza looked at him for a long moment, and a sense of resolve appeared in her eyes. "I want that," she said. "But it will take a lot of time to rebuild everything." "We have time if we're both willing to work for it," Grayson replied. They sat in silence for a while, but it was no longer the silence of estrangement. It was a silence that marked the beginning of understanding. The next day, Grayson decided to meet with Andrew. He knew this step was necessary, even if it was the last thing he wanted. Andrew was seated at a table in the small cafe where they had agreed to meet. He looked uneasy but tried to maintain a calm demeanor. "Thanks for coming," Grayson said, sitting down across from him. "It's the least I could do," Andrew replied. Grayson got straight to the point. Eliza said she wants to stay with me, and I want to try to save our marriage. But for that to happen, I need to understand what you want. Andrew fell silent, staring at the coffee cup in front of him. I want this child to have the best life I can give them, he finally said. And what does that mean for us? Grayson asked. It means I won't interfere with your marriage, Andrew replied. But I can't and won't walk away from my child. Grayson looked at him closely, trying to gauge his sincerity. You realize this will be difficult? He said. I know, Andrew replied, but I'm willing to work through it. Grayson nodded. Then we'll need to set clear boundaries and agree on how this will work. Andrew agreed, and they began discussing the details. When Grayson returned home, he told Eliza about their conversation. She looked both confused and relieved. This will be hard, she said. But it's possible, he replied. Their lives had changed, but they began building a new foundation. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was the start of a new chapter. And now, they had hope. Grayson felt their lives slowly shifting into a new rhythm. Every morning, he woke up next to Eliza and saw in her eyes the effort to rebuild the trust they had lost. She began to talk more about their future, suggesting plans that felt warm and genuine. Andrew, too, took a step back. He came around only when necessary, in the context of the child, and kept his distance, as he had promised. Weeks passed, and Grayson began to believe their family could survive the chaos. He even felt a sense of pride for enduring the ordeal and staying true to his principles. But deep down, his intuition, honed by years as a psychologist, whispered that something was still not right. One evening, when Eliza came home later than usual, she explained it was due to work delays. Her voice was calm, even a little tired, but there was a note of unease that Grayson couldn't ignore. He chose not to ask questions, but the small detail lingered in his mind. The next day, he started paying closer attention to her behavior. Eliza suddenly became more meticulous about her appearance. She carefully selected her outfits, even for casual outings, and her phone was often on silent. Grayson noticed but kept quiet, analyzing the situation. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but his suspicions grew. A few days later, he had an opportunity to test his theory. Eliza said she was going to meet a friend and left her phone at home. Grayson decided to take advantage of the opportunity. He felt uncomfortable invading her privacy, but he couldn't ignore his instincts. The phone was locked, but on her laptop, Grayson found messages exchanged with Andrew. They were short but telling. They had arranged meetings, discussed plans, and even shared private jokes that only they would understand. It felt like a punch to the gut. Grayson closed the laptop and tried to gather his thoughts. He knew that anger and resentment wouldn't help him find the right way forward. He needed a plan, but this time, it wasn't a plan to save their marriage. It was a plan to protect himself. He decided not to confront Eliza about what he had discovered. Instead, Grayson began preparing for his own version of the ending. He copied the messages and saved them, knowing they would eventually become key evidence. Then he started to act subtly but confidently. He spent more time outside the house, working on new projects, meeting friends he hadn't seen in years. Eliza noticed the changes, but didn't suspect the real reason behind them. One day, he suggested a small getaway. They went to the mountains for a few days, surrounded by nothing but nature and each other. Eliza seemed happy, even a bit relaxed, and Grayson almost believed that her feelings for him were genuine. But during one of their conversations, she casually mentioned having a meeting immediately after they returned. It was said innocently enough, but Grayson already knew exactly who that meeting would be with. He decided to use this moment. After returning home, he once again checked her laptop and found new messages with Andrew, confirming his suspicions. Now he had not just doubts but solid evidence. However, instead of starting an argument, he chose a different path. The next day, Grayson organized a gathering with friends. It was an unexpected idea that surprised Eliza, but she agreed. He invited not only mutual friends, but also a few new acquaintances, including a young woman named Lana. Lana was bright, charismatic, and immediately drew the attention of the room, including Eliza's. Grayson spent most of the evening in Lana's company, exuding an ease and confidence that had long been absent from his relationship with Eliza. Eliza tried to mask her jealousy, but it was hard. She made several attempts to pull Grayson into conversations, but he acted as if she were just another guest. This left her feeling uneasy, but she said nothing. That evening, after the guests had left, Eliza tried to talk to him. "What was that?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "What was what?" Grayson replied, feigning ignorance. "You spent the whole evening with Lana. It looked strange." "Why strange?" he asked. "We were just talking." Eliza fell silent. She couldn't come up with an argument that wouldn't reveal her own guilt. This conversation was the first signal for her that Grayson was no longer the man he used to be. Over the following weeks, he continued acting differently, distant yet confident. He no longer tried to control her or guess her thoughts. This made Eliza nervous. The culmination came when Grayson invited Eliza to dinner at her favorite restaurant. She took it as an attempt to mend their relationship, but instead, he calmly laid copies of her messages with Andrew in front of her. "I know everything," he said, looking her straight in the eye, "but I'm not going to fight for our marriage anymore." Eliza said nothing, her face growing pale. "I'll give you time to pack your things and leave," he continued. "You can take whatever you want, but I don't want to see you in our house anymore." She tried to justify herself, but Grayson raised his hand to stop her. "There's no need for explanations," he said. "We had a chance to fix this, but you chose otherwise." These words marked the final verdict for their relationship. After the breakup, Grayson felt liberated. He sold the house they had lived in together and moved to a new place, one that symbolized the start of a fresh life. Lana, who eventually became his friend, supported him through this difficult period. Eliza and Andrew disappeared from his life but left him with a lesson he would never forget. Sometimes, to find yourself, you have to lose what once seemed irreplaceable. Now he lived with a sense of freedom and faith that his future would be happy, even if the path to that happiness had been challenging. Several years passed. Eliza and Andrew, despite all their promises, couldn't build a happy life together. Their romance, which had started with passion, gradually turned into disappointment. Their child, little Noah, remained the only thing connecting them, but even that wasn't enough to keep them together. Eliza moved to another city, leaving Noah in Andrew's care. Though Andrew was a good father, he often struggled with his own insecurities. Their separation became a quiet end to a story that had been doomed from the start. Grayson, on the other hand, found a new life with Lana. They married 2 years after meeting and eventually had a daughter, Sophia. Grayson, who once saw himself as betrayed and broken, was now a happy husband and father. His new family became his anchor, and every day with Lana and Sophia was filled with warmth and love. Sometimes Grayson reflected on the past, but without pain. He knew that the challenges he had faced had made him stronger and helped him find true happiness. For him, life had become both simple and profound, the way he had always dreamed it could be. Can betrayal be forgiven if it brings a new beginning?